She is falling. Not the falling you feel in a dream, the kind that wakes you just before impact. This is real. The air is screaming past her ears. The Amazon canopy is rising toward her, impossibly fast. She is still strapped to her seat. Her name is Juliane Koepcke. She is 17 years old, and she has just been thrown from a commercial aircraft at 10,000 feet. It is December 24th, 1971. Christmas Eve. 91 people were on LANSA Flight 508 when it entered the storm over the Peruvian jungle. 91 people fell. Only one survived. This is her story. To understand how Juliane Koepcke survived, you first have to understand who she was before the sky fell. She was not an adventurer. She was not a soldier. She was not trained in wilderness survival or emergency medicine. She was a 17-year-old girl who had just finished high school. She liked animals. She liked being in the forest. She liked her parents. But those parents, and the life they gave her, made her into something rare, something the jungle could not kill. Juliane Margareta Koepcke was born on October 10, 1954 in Lima, Peru. Her father, Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, was a German zoologist who had emigrated to South America in the late 1940s. He was a careful, methodical man, the kind of scientist who filled notebooks with tiny handwriting and spent years on a single research question. He was an ornithologist, a student of birds, and Peru was one of the richest bird habitats on the planet. Her mother, Maria Koepcke, was something extraordinary even by the standards of her time. Born in Hamburg, Germany in 1924, she had pursued science in an era when women in academia were rare and women in field biology were rarer still. She earned her doctorate in zoology. She published research. She traveled to Peru not as a tourist or a curiosity seeker, but as a scientist with a specific mission: to document the birds and mammals of the Amazon basin with the same rigor that had been applied to the birds of Europe and North America. Together, Hans Wilhelm and Maria established Panguana, a biological research station on the banks of the Uyapichis River, deep in the Huánuco region of the Peruvian Amazon. They named it after the panguana bird, a species of tinamou native to the region. It was not a comfortable outpost. It was remote. It was humid. It flooded seasonally. The nearest town was hours away by river. It was Juliane's home. She spent her early childhood moving between Lima and Panguana. In the city, she was a schoolgirl. In the jungle, she was something else entirely. She learned to move through dense undergrowth. She learned to read the forest floor for signs of water. She learned which fruits were safe and which were not. She learned to recognize the calls of hundreds of bird species. She learned from her father that when you are lost in the jungle, you find a stream and follow it downstream. Always downstream. The water knows the way out. Her parents were not teaching her survival skills in any formal sense. They were simply living their lives, doing their work, and she was watching and absorbing. Children learn what they live. Juliane lived in the Amazon. By the time she was a teenager, she was her parents' field assistant, cataloging specimens, taking measurements, writing observations. She had spent more hours in the Peruvian rainforest than most people spend outdoors in their entire lives. In 1971, she was 17. She had just completed her Abitur, the German high school diploma, at the German school in Lima. She was looking forward to university. She was thinking about zoology, like her parents. She was thinking about the future. She was not thinking about survival. She had no reason to. December 1971. Lima, Peru. The holiday season in Lima was hot and bright. The city sat on the Pacific coast, perpetually dry, cooled by ocean winds. Christmas decorations lined the streets. Families prepared for the holidays. Juliane and her mother were preparing for a trip, Hans Wilhelm had already traveled to Panguana to prepare the station for their arrival. Now Maria and Juliane would follow. They booked tickets on LANSA Flight 508, a domestic flight from Lima to Pucallpa, the nearest city to Panguana. From Pucallpa, they would take a smaller boat upriver. The flight was operated by Líneas Aéreas Nacionales S.A., known as LANSA. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-188 Electra, a 4-engine turboprop that had entered service in the late 1950s. It was not a new aircraft. LANSA was not a new airline, but they were cheap, and they flew the routes that mattered, the routes connecting Lima to the jungle interior. What Juliane did not know, what most passengers did not know, was that LANSA had a troubled history. The airline had already suffered 2 fatal crashes, one in 1970 that killed 99 people, another in 1971 earlier that same year. Aviation authorities had raised concerns. The airline had been temporarily suspended and then reinstated. Safety standards were inconsistent. None of this was advertised on the ticket. Juliane wore a white sleeveless mini dress with a small flower pattern. She wore sandals. She had no coat, no boots, no rain gear. Why would she? It was a 1-hour flight. She was going to her father's house for Christmas. She and her mother found their seats. The plane was nearly full, 86 passengers and 6 crew members, families, workers, people heading home for the holidays. The cabin was loud with pre-flight noise, bags being stowed, children being settled, the dull roar of turboprops warming up on the tarmac. Flight 508 departed Lima at noon on December 24, 1971. For the first 20 minutes, it was ordinary. The storm appeared without warning. Over the Andean foothills east of Lima, a massive cumulonimbus cell had built during the morning hours. These storms, common in the transition zone between the mountains and the jungle, can rise to heights of 50,000 feet. They contain updrafts powerful enough to tear aircraft apart. Experienced pilots avoid them. They reroute. They wait. The crew of Flight 508 did not reroute. Whether this was a navigation error, a pressure to stay on schedule, or a simple miscalculation of the storm's severity, we do not know. What we know is that approximately 25 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft entered the storm. The turbulence was immediate and violent. The plane lurched. Overhead bins burst open. Luggage fell into the aisle. Passengers screamed and grabbed for armrests. Then came the lightning. Witnesses on the ground later reported seeing a bolt strike the right wing of the aircraft. The wing caught fire. Within seconds, the fire reached the fuel tank. The explosion tore the aircraft apart at altitude. Not a gradual disintegration, not a controlled emergency. The fuselage split. The tail section separated, the cabin depressurized in an instant, a pressure differential so sudden that it was like the inside of the plane being turned inside out. People, seats, luggage, pieces of the aircraft, everything was sucked into the open sky. Juliane was seated with her mother. She remembers the turbulence. She remembers the screaming. She remembers her mother turning to her and saying in a voice that was very quiet and very calm, "This is it." Then she remembers nothing. She was still strapped to her seat, a bench of 3 seats with 2 other passengers beside her, when she was ejected from the aircraft. The 3 of them spun together through open air, the seat acting as a strange, terrible anchor. The altitude was approximately 10,000 feet. Below her, 3 million square miles of unbroken Amazon rainforest. She lost consciousness somewhere in the fall. She does not remember the trees. When she woke, she was on the ground. It was still December 24th. It was late afternoon or early evening. The light was low and green, filtering through a canopy so thick that the sky was invisible. The air smelled of wet earth and vegetation. Something was buzzing near her face. She was alive. She lay still for a moment, the way animals do after a shock before the pain arrives. Then she took inventory. Her head hurt. There was blood above her right eye, a gash from something she couldn't identify. The eye itself was swollen nearly shut. She moved her arms. Her right collarbone sent a sharp signal, fractured or close to it. She moved her legs. They worked. She had one sandal, the other was gone. She had a small bag of candy that had been in her pocket. The bag was intact. She had her dress. She had her life. She called for her mother. She called several times, her voice rising into the canopy and disappearing. Nothing came back. She called for anyone. The jungle answered with its own sounds, birds calling in the distance, insects in the undergrowth, the drip of water from leaves somewhere above. She was alone. She sat with this fact for what she later described as a long time, not panicking. She was too shocked for panic, but absorbing it, processing it. She had fallen from an aircraft. She was in the Amazon. She did not know where. She did not know how far from anything. But she knew one thing. Her father's voice from 100 field lessons was very clear in her memory. Find water. Follow it downstream. The water knows the way out. She looked around her until she found a small trickle, water moving over a root, collecting in a depression. She followed the trickle. It became a stream. She began to walk. Day 1 became day 2. The stream was her guide and her companion. She moved along its bank, pushing through undergrowth that grabbed at her bare arm and her single-sandaled foot. The jungle floor was soft and uneven. Roots, mud, fallen branches, the detritus of a forest that never stopped growing and never stopped dying. Her collarbone throbbed with every step. The wound above her eye was swollen and hot. She ate the candy one piece at a time, rationing it the way her parents had taught her to ration supplies in the field. She thought about her mother constantly. She told herself that her mother had survived, that she was downstream, that they would find each other at the river. She did not allow herself to think otherwise. The jungle at night was different from the jungle during the day. The sounds changed. The daytime birds fell silent and the nighttime animals took over. Frogs, insects she couldn't identify. Movement in the undergrowth that she knew rationally was probably small, a rodent, a lizard, but sounded enormous in the dark. She climbed a small rise to sleep away from the floodplain. She lay on the ground and looked up at the canopy and listened to the forest breathe. She was very tired. She slept. Day 3 brought something she had not expected. She found wreckage. Not the main fuselage, she never found that. But the jungle was scattered with pieces of Flight 508. A seat here, a piece of luggage there, clothes hanging from branches 20 feet up, deposited by the initial fall and the tree canopy's strange filtering effect. She found a Christmas cake, a fruit cake in a sealed tin still intact. She opened it and ate carefully, taking small amounts. It was dense and sweet, and she hadn't realized until that moment how hungry she was. She found a bag of hard candy, and then she found the passengers, 3 of them, still strapped to their row of seats as she had been. They had fallen just as she had, ejected from the aircraft, carried by their seats through the canopy. But where she had survived the impact, they had not. They lay half-buried in the soft jungle floor, the earth having received them and begun already to reclaim them. She looked at them for a long time. These were people who had been alive on December 24th, who had been going somewhere, home, to family, to Christmas dinner, who had sat in their seats and heard the turbulence and felt the same terror she had felt. The difference between them and her was a few feet, a slightly different angle of descent, the particular arrangement of trees in one spot versus another. Luck, Only luck. She walked on, days 4, 5, 6, 7. The stream had widened into something more substantial, a proper waterway, maybe 10 feet across, running brown with tannins over a bed of dark mud. She followed it, and it curved and bent through the forest the way all Amazonian waterways do. Not straight, never straight, always winding, always finding the path of least resistance through a landscape that offered endless resistance. The wound above her eye was getting worse. She had noticed it on the second day, a change in texture, a warmth that went beyond normal inflammation. By the fourth day, she knew what it was. The flies had found her. In the Amazon, certain blowfly species lay their eggs in open wounds within hours of injury. The larvae hatch quickly in the heat and humidity. They burrow into living tissue. Left untreated, they can cause serious damage: infection, necrosis, sepsis. Juliane knew this. Her parents had treated animal specimens for exactly this condition. She knew the biology. She knew the danger. She also knew the remedy her father had described: submerge the wound in clean running water and wait. The larvae need air. Without it, they will emerge. She stopped at the stream. She knelt. She held the side of her head below the water's surface, keeping her airway above the current, and she waited. It worked. She has spoken about this moment in interviews with a clinical detachment that is, in its own way, more disturbing than any dramatic retelling could be. She was not stoic because she was hardened or because she didn't feel pain. She was stoic because she understood what was happening, because she had a solution, and because she applied it. There was no room for anything else. She slept on high ground each night above the floodline. She ate fruit she recognized from her years at Panguana. Careful, always careful, never taking anything she couldn't identify. The jungle contained enormous abundance. It also contained poisons that killed within hours. The difference between nourishment and death was knowledge, and she had that knowledge. She did not see another human being. She did not hear a search plane. She walked. By day 8, the river was wide enough to carry a boat. She knew what that meant. Rivers this size were used by fishermen, by woodcutters, by the small communities that scattered through the Peruvian interior. She was getting closer to something. She didn't know what or how far, but the river told her she was moving in the right direction. Her body was telling a different story. 11 days of walking through dense jungle on one sandal and one bare foot had left her feet torn and infected. Her collarbone had settled into a dull, constant ache that sharpened with every uneven step. She had lost significant weight. She was dehydrated despite drinking from the river. The exertion demanded more than she could easily replace. Her immune system was fighting the wound on her face, the cuts on her feet, the insect bites that covered her arms and legs. She was still moving, but she was running out of time, and some part of her knew it. On the 9th day, she found the boat. It was pulled up on the bank, a small wooden dugout, the kind used by local fishermen throughout the Amazon basin. Old, weathered but intact. She searched the immediate area. No one. A narrow path led into the trees. She followed it. 20 meters from the bank, she found a shelter. It was small, a thatched roof over a wooden frame, the kind of temporary structure that woodcutters built at seasonal work sites. Inside, basic supplies, a tin of kerosene, some tools, a rusted tin of engine fuel, gasoline, not kerosene. And then she remembered something else her father had told her. Gasoline applied to skin repels insects and can help address larval infestations in wounds. It was a crude field remedy, not medical, not ideal, but it worked. She used the gasoline on her remaining wounds. She winced. She kept going. She settled into the shelter to wait. Someone owned this boat. Someone would come back. She waited through the rest of day 9, through day 10. She slept on the shelter's floor. She drank from the river. She did not move far. She waited. On day 11, she heard voices. They were speaking Spanish. She knew the accent, the particular cadence of the Peruvian interior different from Lima. 3 men appeared on the path from the river. They stopped when they saw her. Their names were Amado Pereira, Nestor Rivera, and Marcio Rivera. They were woodcutters who worked in the area seasonally. They had come back to their shelter to find a teenage girl, pale, injured, dressed in a tattered white dress sitting in the shadows of their hut. They thought she was a river spirit. In the folk traditions of the Peruvian Amazon, there are stories of supernatural beings, spirits that take human form and inhabit the waterways. The men later told journalists they had genuinely believed for a moment that they were looking at one of these beings. She spoke. She told them in Spanish that her plane had crashed, that she had been walking for 11 days, that she was injured and needed help. They were not sure they believed her, but they helped her. They brought her food. They cleaned her wounds as best they could. They gave her dry clothes to replace the tattered dress. They spoke to her gently, the way you speak to someone who has been through something you cannot quite comprehend. The next morning, they put her in the boat. The journey downstream to the nearest medical station, at Torna Vista, a small settlement on the Pachitea River, took 7 hours by boat. 7 hours on the river that had guided her for 11 days. She arrived at Torna Vista on January 3, 1972. A local pilot named Donald Lawrence happened to be at the station. He took one look at her and arranged an immediate flight to the hospital in Pucallpa. Hans Wilhelm Koepcke had been searching for his wife and daughter since December 25th. He had joined the search parties. He had flown over sections of jungle looking for wreckage. He had been told by multiple sources that there were no survivors. He was at the airstrip in Pucallpa when the small plane landed. His daughter walked off the aircraft under her own power. He could not speak. He held her for a long time. She asked about her mother. He did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. The search that followed found the wreckage of LANSA Flight 508 scattered across a wide area of jungle northeast of the Andean foothills. Of the 92 people on board, investigators found evidence that at least 14 others had survived the initial crash and fall. They had been found alive, injured, waiting for rescue that never came in time. The jungle, the injuries, the exposure, these things took them before the search teams arrived. Maria Koepcke was found not far from the main crash site. She had survived the fall. She had been alive for several days, possibly as many as 9 or 10 days. She had been injured but conscious. She had waited the way most people wait in a crisis for help to come to her. Help had not come in time. Juliane has reflected on this in interviews many times over the decades since. The detail that she was trained to move, that she knew to follow the water, to keep walking, to trust the river, may have been the precise difference between her fate and her mother's. Her mother was a brilliant scientist, a stronger adult, a more experienced person in almost every way. But she did not have that one specific piece of knowledge, or did not trust it, or was too injured to act on it. 11 days, same jungle, same crash, different outcomes. The costs of living sometimes are paid in the smallest margins. Juliane spent several weeks recovering in the hospital in Pucallpa. Her collarbone healed. Her wounds were treated. Her body, 17 years old and strong from years of jungle fieldwork, repaired itself with the efficiency of youth. Her mind took longer. She returned to Germany with her father. She had family there. Her parents were German. She had spent time in Germany. She had the cultural connections that made it a place of refuge. She needed for a time to be away from Peru, away from the jungle, away from the questions to Rome, and there were many questions. LANSA Flight 508 became one of the most analyzed aviation disasters in South American history. The airline had a catastrophic safety record. The decision to fly into the storm was eventually attributed to a combination of schedule pressure, inadequate weather information, and a systemic disregard for safety protocols that had characterized LANSA's operations for years. The airline was eventually shut down permanently in 1972, following yet another crash. Juliane gave interviews. She testified. She answered the same questions many times. She was 17 years old, and she was asked repeatedly to relive the worst experience of her life for the benefit of journalists and investigators and curious strangers. She did it. And then she tried to move forward. She studied. That was the path forward. It had always been the path her parents had laid for her, and she walked it. She completed her secondary education. She enrolled at the University of Kiel in Germany, studying biology. She transferred to Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, where she eventually earned her doctorate in mammalogy, the study of mammals. She specialized in the bat species of the Peruvian Amazon. Bats, in the jungle. She went back, not immediately. It took years before she could return to Peru without being overwhelmed. The memories were not just psychological, they were physical. The smell of the jungle, the sound of rain on leaves, the particular quality of light through a forest canopy. These things carried weight that she had to learn to carry. But she went back. She went to Panguana, her parents' research station, her childhood home. The station had continued operating, maintained by local staff and funded by intermittent scientific grants. She took it over. She ran it. She built it into a serious research institution that has continued to operate for decades. She published scientific papers. She cataloged species. She did the work her parents had done before her, in the same place, with the same rigor and patience. In 1998, she wrote a memoir, in German titled Wenn ich die weiße Taube fliegen sehe, translated, When I See the White Dove Fly. In 2011, it was published in English under the title When I Fall from the Sky. The book is not a thriller. It is not written to maximize drama. It is written the way a scientist writes, carefully, honestly, with attention to detail and a resistance to sentimentality. It is, in its own way, more powerful for that restraint. That same year, 2011, filmmaker Werner Herzog, the German director known for his films about obsession and the natural world, released a documentary about Juliane's story. He called it Wings of Hope. He had a personal connection to the story. He had been booked on a LANSA flight in 1971 and had changed his plans at the last minute. The flight he had canceled was the one before Flight 508. He had been, he said, very nearly part of the story himself. He asked Juliane to return to the jungle with him, to walk the path she had walked, to stand in the places she had stood. She agreed. The documentary shows her moving through the forest with an ease that is remarkable and, on reflection, not surprising at all. This is her place. This is where she grew up. The jungle that the world sees as threatening, as dark, as a place to survive, she sees as home. Herzog asked her if she was afraid. She paused. She said that she had never been afraid of the jungle itself. She was afraid in those 11 days of not finding her mother, of being alone, of dying without being found. But the jungle, the trees, the river, the animals, these things were not her enemies. The jungle is not cruel, she said. It is indifferent, and that, for me, was enough. Panguana became a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve candidate in the 2000s, with Juliane leading the effort to have it formally protected. The biodiversity of the site, catalogued by her parents and continued by her, made a compelling scientific case for protection. She gave lectures. She spoke at conferences. She became quietly one of the most respected voices in Amazonian conservation biology. Not because of the crash. She resisted always being defined by that single event, but because of the decades of work that followed it. She married. She had a family. She built a life in which the crash was one event among many, the most dramatic, the most defining, but not the only one. She is in her 70s now. She still goes to Panguana. She still works. There is a question that follows Juliane Koepcke through every interview, every documentary, every retelling of her story. It is the question that follows anyone who has survived something that killed everyone else around them. Why her? She has answered it many ways over the years: the training, the knowledge, the river, the luck of her particular seat position, of the angle of her fall, of the specific arrangement of trees in that specific patch of jungle. Any one of these factors removed and she does not survive. But there is something else in her answer. Something she returns to, in different forms, across decades of interviews. She survived because she moved, not because she was the strongest or the bravest or the best equipped, but because she had been taught by people who loved her and lived their work that the jungle rewards movement. That water flows toward people, that the cost of staying still in a situation like hers is higher than any other cost. Her mother was brilliant and capable and experienced, and she stayed still. 14 other passengers survived the fall and stayed still. The jungle took them. Juliane walked. 11 days, kilometers of riverbank, 1 sandal, a broken collarbone, a wound full of larvae she extracted with her own hands in a cold brown stream. She walked. The Amazon is still there. The trees are taller now. The river still runs brown to the sea. At Panguana, the same birds that Juliane's mother catalogued 50 years ago still call from the same trees. And somewhere on the bank of the Uyapichis River, a scientist is still doing the work. She went back to the jungle that took everything from her, and she made it her life's work to protect it.